Hello and welcome to another edition of It's About Money. I'm Nanette Nokan. Thank you for joining us. You may know somebody who's in a nursing home right now or receiving some assistance at home to take care of their physical needs. Today we're fortunate to have an attorney. Her name is Donna Heichman. She's an attorney at Woods Oviatt Gilman LLP, and she's here to talk about Medicare and Medicaid planning, mostly Medicaid. Thank you for being here, Donna.
Thank you.
I appreciate you being here. I know you're an expert and I count on you on a lot of questions I have for Medicaid planning. Now, a lot of people confuse Medicare and Medicaid. Let's talk about that a little bit and differentiate the two.
Medicare is the health care provider that you automatically qualify for on a basis of age. Medicaid is a governmental program which provides medical assistance to individuals who are considered poor or disabled.
I see.
Medicaid is a joint state program, joint federal and state program. The federal government provides the guidelines to the states so that the states have a certain amount of discretion when they're deciding or establishing their Medicaid program. But the federal government is providing the guidelines and the states need to abide within those guidelines. And they can have a certain amount of discretion, as I mentioned. It's important to understand, though, that these federal guidelines exist and the states have some amount of discretion within those guidelines because the Medicaid program is very state-specific. Right. Today we're going to be focusing on, of course, New York State. But if you have a client or a loved one who lives in another state, it's important to make sure that you're seeking expertise with an attorney who's licensed in that particular state.
Okay, so Medicare is pretty much uniform across the country, but
That's
Medicaid
right.
is administered through the states, so they may have guidelines that differ from one from another.
That's right. And in fact, locally, the Medicaid program is administered within the counties by the local Department of Social Services.
I see. Okay, so it's really the county itself. So even in our area, Monroe might be different from Wayne in Ontario.
Well, the rules are the same throughout the states, but they're actually administered. So when you would apply for Medicaid benefits, you would be looking at the county in which you were last a resident of before you entered either an assisted living facility or a nursing home.
I see. Okay, I understand. So the guidelines are the same, it's just administered differently. So the people that you talk to are going to be different, the office is going to be different from one county to the next. I got it. Now, when does an elderly who require long-term care become eligible for Medicaid?
Medicaid is a needs-based program. As I mentioned, it provides medical assistance to the poor and the disabled. So you need to fit into what New York State has defined as qualifying as someone who's poor. Medicaid is not really income-based, except to the extent that you would have sufficient income to pay for the nursing home care. So to the extent you are generating sufficient income to pay the $90,000 to $100,000 that a nursing home often is, the income is not going to render you ineligible. It's really your assets that the local Department of Social Services will be looking at to determine whether or not you're Medicaid eligible.
I see. Okay. So basically, when we're looking at an expense of $90,000 to $110,000 a year, you want to look at what kind of income or asset you have. The income, like you said, is not so much an issue. It's the asset that you have before eligibility for Medicaid.
Right.
Okay.
Income is considered, and it's part of the contribution towards the nursing home care.
Okay.
The cost of it once you are determined to be Medicaid eligible. But it's your actual assets that determine whether or not you're Medicaid eligible.
Okay. Let's talk about some of those numbers. What are the requirements for eligibility for Medicaid? Do you have to be destitute? Can you have $150,000? What's the level?
The level depends on your particular situation. It differs between whether or not you're applying as a single individual or whether or not you're applying as part of a couple. Okay. Sometimes what will happen is there'll be a husband and wife, and it'll be one of them who enters the nursing home and the other spouse is able to remain in the community. So there are special community resource allowances or exemptions that are available to the community spouse. When we're talking about the individual who's in the nursing home, whether or not they're single or whether or not they're part of a couple, but they are the person who's been institutionalized, they have a pretty low level of assets that they're able to retain and still qualify for Medicaid. Specifically, they're able to have, in 2006, liquid assets of $4,150. They're able to retain their personal property. They are able to have a cemetery plot and marker, and they're able to establish a burial fund. That burial fund is currently of an unlimited amount. The standard within New York State is a reasonable funeral for someone of those means. Okay. And you establish the burial fund by going to a funeral home of your choice, pre-selecting items such as caskets and the like, paying that money over to the funeral home, which then assists the client with establishing a burial fund in the form of an irrevocable trust.
I see.
That irrevocable trust format is very important. That's what makes it exempt from Medicaid. And in fact, you don't want to overfund the burial expenses. One reason why it's set up in that format is if, in fact, you have qualified for Medicaid and after your death, the burial fund is applied towards the actual burial costs. If there's any remaining or excess money remaining in the burial fund, that will immediately go to New York State for reimbursement for the medical expenses paid.
Wow, wow. You know, it's kind of interesting because when somebody is about to enter a nursing home, there's a lot of, I'm sure, anxiety about kind of making that next stage in life that leads to the end, right? And then you think about burial planning, but on the other hand, if you don't, someone's going to have to pay for the final expenses, and where is that going to come from?
That's right, and it's an easy way to set aside $7,000, $8,000, $9,000. The amount will be lower if, in fact, the client wishes to have a cremation. But it's an easy way to make sure that that is an expense that's been taken care of for your family. When we're talking about Medicaid planning, and that's obviously one of the more unpleasant tasks that I have to talk about with people to establishing, I do explain to them that one benefit of it is it's something that your family will not have to take care of when they're mourning you. So by having it done in advance, it's something that after the death occurs will already have been taken care of.
And I think it's so smart. The other piece is, they know exactly what you want because you made the choices, right?
That's
Instead of the children fighting about, gee, mom would have wanted that or dad would have wanted that. Just kind of get it over with. Just on a side, I had this story. I suggested this to a client, and she says, Nanette, I even got my stone. I said, oh, that's great. So then 2 years later, she said, I changed my mind. I didn't like that stone after all. I said, well, that's all right. You're making the choice yourself. But it is smart. You're right to set aside those funds so that it's available for later use. So then what about, so that's available for the Medicaid patient, right?
Medicaid applicant.
Yes. Okay. And then what about in a couple situation?
In the couple situation, again, the institutionalized spouse is able to retain those assets that I just mentioned. The community spouse has more liberal exemptions that are available to them. First of all, they're able to retain liquid assets in the form of savings or otherwise of at least $74,820. That amount can be up to $99,540, so it's within a range. And that range depends on how much assets the client has at the time they enter the nursing home.
I see. So someone who may have $300,000 can't feel really safe about keeping those assets because they'd have to diminish it to an allowance that's permissible before they can qualify for Medicaid.
That's right.
Right.
In addition to the Community Spouse Resource Allowance, which again is the minimum of almost $75,000 and can almost get up to $100,000, the community spouse is also able to retain the homestead.
Oh, okay.
That's the house, and it's available so long as that community spouse is actually residing in the home.
I see.
Currently, one of the changes under the new rules that we're going to speak about, the recent federal legislation that changed a lot of the Medicaid rules, in particular regarding planning, that homestead is now limited to equity of $750,000. Now that sounds like a fairly large equity limit, and certainly it's within the federal guidelines, it's within the highest that the states are able to select. But you have to remember that this is a statewide number, and that's applicable to homes located in Long Island or Manhattan.
I see. So in our area, that's nicer because then people, for the most part, people be able to retain their homes. Yeah.
That's right.
So probably one of the good planning ideas there is if you have a mortgage, you might want to pay that down
Pay
or
off
pay
the
it
mortgage.
off.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In fact, I had one situation with a husband and wife where they had opted in their elderly years to forego the time and expense of having a home, and so they resided in an apartment. When the husband entered a nursing home, the wife had about $200,000 of too much assets. In other words, excess assets above the exemption amount she was allowed to retain. So what she decided to do was go back into home ownership. She purchased a ranch condominium, so she was able to have someone else helping her with the yard work. She did not have stairs, and she was able to immediately transfer her $200,000 of excess resources into an exempt resource. That is the homestead.
That's great, and that's an allowed action to take.
That's right. There's no penalties associated with doing that.
That's great. Now, you mentioned about the new rules that have just come out, federal guidelines. Could you speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, those federal rules, actually, there was legislation that was enacted federally on February 8th, 2006. Those have become effective in New York for Medicaid applications submitted after August 1st, 2006, so they are fully enforced now.
Okay.
They actually largely affect the concepts of, there's many changes. In particular, one of those was setting a limit on the equity of the home, which previously to this legislation had been unlimited. It also greatly affected the ability to make gifts. Not necessarily the ability to make gifts, but the rules with regard to them.
I see. Okay. Now, what about transferring assets? You know, usually people say, well, gee, mom is having to enter a nursing home. Can you just give me the money? There are a lot of guidelines around that. Can you speak on that a little bit? Like what transferring assets?
That's right. This whole idea of transferring assets is something that individuals consider so that they're getting within the resource exemptions that we've already discussed sooner than having to spend down their assets on their cost of care. So kind of helping the process out, getting down to these resource exemptions so they qualify for Medicaid sooner than simply entering a nursing home and spending down their assets.
I see. Conserving some of that to be able to leave it as inheritance for the children.
That's right. And the rules changed significantly regarding them, as I mentioned, in this new legislation, which was enacted February 8th and is effective in New York State at this point. That affects the time periods which are related to the transferring of gifts. As you may know, there are two, in particular, time periods associated with an individual makes gifts in an effort to qualify for Medicaid benefits. The first of these time periods is referred to as the look-back period. The look-back period is the time period that the local Department of Social Services will review your asset and income information in order to determine whether or not transfers or gifts occurred. That time period is currently, and based upon this new legislation, is 5 years for everyone across the board, although there is a phase-in time period because it's moving from the previous look-back period, which was 3 years. Actually, the previous rule was 3 years unless there was a trust involved, in which case it was 5 years as well.
I see.
This look-back period is actually the time period during which you must support the Medicaid application. In other words, you're submitting a Medicaid application and you're providing the local Department of Social Services with 5 years, up to 5 years worth of asset and income information, again, so that they can review comprehensively what activity occurred within your accounts to determine whether or not gifts or other transfers occurred.
I see. And if there were gifts that transferred, what are the ramifications?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is if gifts were made, remember that if you are making a gift and you are able to make it past the 5-year look-back period, there's no ramification at all on your estate, on the Medicaid eligibility.
Okay.
The reason why is because once this 5-year time period passes, the transfer will no longer be considered and will no longer actually even be found on the asset information that's provided to the Department of Social Services. So as far as planning techniques, we've already mentioned the first one is to fit your assets within the asset exemption amounts, which we've already discussed. But the second is you can go ahead and do gifting if you believe you can make it, or if you can make it beyond the 5-year look-back period. Now, if you can't make it beyond the 5-year look-back period, the second time period associated with Medicaid planning becomes relevant. That time period is referred to as the period of ineligibility.
Okay.
That is the time period or penalty which is imposed upon you by the state for having made transfers of assets. And the actual penalty is a certain time period that you are ineligible for Medicaid for having made the gift. Now, the period of ineligibility is calculated by a formula. Okay, so you have to be good with numbers when you determine the period of ineligibility. But basically, what you do to determine that is you take the dollar amount of the gifts that were made during the look-back period, divide it by the number that, or the dollar amount that the state tells us is the average cost of care in the area in which you reside.
Okay.
In Rochester for 2006, that number is $7,375 per month, or roughly $7,400 per month. So let me give you an example, because I think that helps clarify this period of ineligibility. If I had a client who transferred $74,000 to a child, the period of ineligibility would be 10 months.
Okay.
That's determined by dividing the $74,000 gift by roughly $7,400 per month and coming up with a period of ineligibility. Now that calculation stays the same despite the fact that we had this recent federal legislation. What has changed is the timing of the running of the period of ineligibility.
Okay.
For transfers which were made under the prior law, that is prior to February 8th, 2006, the old rules still apply. And the penalty period, which is calculated by the formula, begins to run the first month after the gift was made. So if I had a client who made a gift December 31st of 2005, the $74,000 gift, that 10-month period of ineligibility would begin to run January 1st and would run out by the end of October.
I see.
So the sooner, under the prior law, the sooner a gift got made, the sooner the period of ineligibility began to run. And even if that gift was found within the 5-year look-back period, if the penalty period had already run, then it would no longer affect the Medicaid eligibility.
Okay.
So there was some misconception back then that if you couldn't make it through the 3-year look-back period and you made a gift, you would necessarily be ineligible for Medicaid, but that wasn't necessarily true. It really depended on this period of ineligibility.
That's right. We're talking about Medicaid. My guest today is Donna Heichman, attorney at Woods Oviatt Gilman. We'll take a break.
What do you get when you cross a soprano with a cardiologist? Someone who'll sing their heart out. Just what they're doing at a local community theater. See, the Sopranos Choir and the Cardiologist Hospital contacted their community coalition and started a children's theater. They knew busy kids are less likely to try drugs. And that's music to everyone's ears. What can your group do? Contact your community coalition at helpyourcommunity.org. Because you get more
when you get together.
One day, you were simply struggling to be a dad. The next, you're coping with a diagnosis of childhood cancer. CureSearch.org can help. It's run by doctors and scientists whose research has led to an overall cure rate of 78%. You're not as alone as you feel.
Welcome back. I'm Nanette Nokon, and our guest is Donna Heichman from Woods Oviatt Gilman. We're talking about Medicaid eligibility. Thanks for being here again, Donna. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Now, we talked a great deal about asset exempt resource levels. Let's talk about the income resource levels. Can you speak of what limitations there are?
Yes. As I mentioned, income will only render you ineligible for Medicaid if you have sufficient income to pay for the nursing home costs. And again, as we talked about, it's roughly between $90,000 to $110,000, depending on what facility we're talking about. When you're looking at Medicaid eligibility, though, the Department of Social Services will consider the income that the individual has or the couple has. And just like we have resource exemptions, there are also income allowances. And those income allowances are determined based on who is generating the income. Let's first of all talk about the person who is in the nursing home. Once they're Medicaid eligible, they are only allowed to retain their first $50 of income per month.
Wow, that much.
Yes, that $50 is supposed to cover the personal needs of them while they're in the nursing home. In other words, things that aren't covered by the Medicaid.
The care cuts, things like that.
That's right. Okay. They are also allowed to retain sufficient income to pay for health insurance premiums. So for example, if payments are still being made to Blue Choice Senior or Preferred Care, those can still continue to be made. It's very important to the Department of Social Services that the health insurance is maintained in case the individual becomes hospitalized or has other needs that can be covered by the health insurance. For the community spouse in a spousal situation, New York State allows the community spouse to retain a certain dollar amount of income as well, again, the income allowance, and that income allowance is roughly $2,500 per month. The actual number is $2,489 per month. And if the community spouse does not generate enough of their own income to bring them up to that level, then we can transfer income over from the community spouse or from the institutionalized spouse over to the community spouse to bring them up to that level.
I see. So they're allowed roughly $2,500 to
Yes.
be able to sustain their lifestyle.
That's right. Now, if in fact the couple ends up having excess income above and beyond those allowance amounts, and I'd like to also point out that the community spouse can also retain enough income to, in addition to the roughly $2,500 per month, to pay their health insurance premiums as well, and if they also have a long-term health care insurance policy, enough to help pay for that policy as well.
I see.
If the couple has excess income above and beyond those amounts, the Department of Social Services looks very closely to see who's earning the income. If the excess income is being earned by the institutionalized spouse, then it's subject to 100% contribution towards the nursing home care. Then the Medicaid program will pay the balance of the cost of the nursing home care. With regard to the community spouse, if it's the community spouse income that is earning, or that is in excess of the allowances, then that income is subject to a 25% contribution rate. So it's very important to look at, see which spouse is earning the income and what income, how much income there is above and beyond the allowance amounts.
I see. A really complicated path to go through. That's why you need an attorney to help you do this.
That's right.
Yeah. Now, how about assets in a way that they're treated? There are different types of assets treated differently by Medicaid. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, we can talk about some very specific assets because, again, the Department of Social Services is going to really look at all assets that the couple has or that the Medicaid applicant has. And none of the assets are not subject to some type of scrutiny. Let's talk first of all about life insurance policies because a lot of clients have those. Life insurance policies are treated at cash surrender value. They are an asset available for nursing home costs. They are treated at cash surrender value, so what is the policy worth today, not necessarily what will it pay out when someone dies. Those life insurance policies can be part of the resource exemptions that we previously mentioned.
Okay.
And it's also important to note that New York State currently has no restrictions on who can be named as the beneficiary of the life insurance policy. So the children or the spouse can still be named as the beneficiary of that life insurance policy, and that's allowable as long as that life insurance policy is within the exemption amount.
I see. Okay. So it's not, the state doesn't require to be the beneficiary. It can be the family.
That's right.
It's the resource
And
amount.
that's an important distinction to make because of annuities. Okay, and which leads us to the next asset that we should talk about.
Right.
Annuities are also often a very important part of an individual's portfolio or asset mix before they are concerned about nursing home costs. Annuities are treated at what they are able to be converted to immediately. Again, if you can pull out the principal from an annuity, it is deemed available for nursing home costs.
Okay.
And so even if there might be surrender charges to pulling out money out of an annuity, or there might be income tax consequences, that doesn't matter. The annuity is considered available for long-term health care costs. Now again, the annuity can be considered or within the asset exemptions that the individual is allowed to have. Now, as I mentioned regarding, I kind of led into annuities by saying that there were restrictions on beneficiaries, and in fact there are with regard to annuities. For annuities that were purchased after February 8, 2006, or for annuities that were annuitized after that date, there are restrictions, and New York State is requiring themselves to be made as the remainder beneficiary of the policy, or the annuity. Now, that is subject to First, if there is a spouse, the spouse can be named, or a minor or disabled child can be named as beneficiaries, preferably above the state. But the state now can require that they be named as a primary beneficiary, again, unless there's a spouse or minor or disabled child.
So a person who's widowed or widower, if they had annuitized their asset, they need to name New York State, unless they have a dependent child who's disabled. Right?
That's right, if they annuitize subsequent to February 8, 2006.
Right,
or if they purchase an annuity. And there's also other criteria. For example, And this is for annuities, by the way, that are not held within retirement benefits. And we'll talk about retirement benefits in just a minute. There are other restrictions on annuities, in particular, for example, which if you don't meet these restrictions, the purchase or annuitizing of an annuity can be considered a gift and a period of ineligibility imposed upon it. In particular, this annuity must be actuarially sound. That's simply defined as the individual who's bought the annuity or annuitized must be receiving back from the annuity at least as much as they paid in.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. Now let's talk about retirement benefits, because that's a significant asset that a lot of individuals have. And this involves assets, whether or not we're talking about 401k plans, IRAs, 403b plans, any type of retirement plan.
Okay.
They are assets which are available for nursing home costs as well. Okay. But there's an important exemption which is now available if that retirement benefit is placed in payout status. Then it will be treated as an income stream and not as an asset. So in other words, if we had a client who had a $400,000 IRA and they placed that IRA into payout status, they would be able to retain their resource exemptions and the IRA.
My. So it really stretches the value of what you have available.
That's right. The current issue with regard to the payout status, though, has to do with whether or not you're able to utilize the IRS minimum distribution rules, or whether or not you must use the Medicaid life expectancy tables. Currently, in particular, with regard to an institutionalized individual, you must use the Medicaid life expectancy tables. So you need to relook the retirement benefits, but it's important to note that we can do special planning with them. Placing them into periodic payment status may be the way to save them.
So with all the complexities here, it really is important to, like I said, I'm saying it over and over, but you have to, because it's just so much for an individual who's dealing with it for the first time to do these things on their own, and they can't. They've got to be able to have a trust set up by an attorney who's experienced.
That's right. I think it's extremely important that when an individual is considering any kind of gifting or looking at what assets are able to be exempted from being spent down in nursing home care, that they receive proper advice from an individual who is well qualified to represent them on these type of matters. So yes, extremely important.
Now, what's your take on long-term care insurance? Some people, are thinking about it, others are not. What's your perspective on that?
Being in the trenches on the Medicaid planning and knowing that even though recommending long-term health care insurance policies actually slows down my business on the Medicaid planning, I highly recommend that individuals consider long-term health care insurance policies. It's the best way to protect their assets from nursing home costs. We don't sell the policies, obviously, and in fact, we make very little recommendations regarding them. We leave them to the experts who do sell the policies. And but it's important to note that individuals consider buying these policies before, number one, they reach an age at where the premiums start to escalate in cost. I think that's somewhere around 50 or 55 years of age. And they consider buying the policies while their health is still such that they can be underwritten.
Right.
As you know, those are big issues, and it's very important that people consider protecting their assets from long-term health care costs by considering these policies.
Yeah, I think my take on this is just a complicated issue. The best thing to do is seek the advice of an attorney who specializes in long-term care, long Medicaid planning, and making sure that the assets and income are protected and mom and dad are okay, or aunt and uncle, or just yourself. So plan early, talk to an attorney. And my guest today is Donna Heichman, attorney from Woods, Oviatt, Gilman. Thank you very much, Donna.
You're welcome.
Until next time, my name is Nanette Nokan, and if you would like to email me or ask me any questions, my email address is nnocon@aol.com. Thank you, and until next time.
Thanks for tuning in. If you have any questions, please email Nanette at nnocon@aol.com. Following production was produced through Penfield Community Television in Penfield, New York.